Hello and welcome to day 2 of the 16th annual Ilan Ramon International Space Conference. My name is Sarah Williamson, and on behalf of the Israeli Space Agency, I would like to thank the audience and the participants for being here with us today. Now, before we start today's proceedings, we would like to show you a short movie about the Israeli Space Agency.
Today, the Israeli Space Agency revolutionized, turning into one of the global space industry leaders, investing in groundbreaking technology, harnessing space as an economic and diplomatic growth engine, creating partnerships and finding new economic frontiers, believing that overcoming the impossible is, in fact, possible. Developments in remote sensing, low Earth satellite communications, microgravity experimentation, and exploring sustainability in space. We continue our pledge to make life better in space and on Earth. Our commitment to find new partners and new possibilities. The Israeli Space Agency, dedicated to space for today and the future.
I'm sure you're as impressed as I am. Now, parallel to the conference, you are welcome to visit the company's exhibition featured in the video and enjoy a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to meet with the biggest people in the international space industry. So now, let's begin today's proceedings by opening with a panel focusing on government outsource and procurement, means of capturing commercial value. In this talk, moderator Gil Peleg, Senior Advisor for International Strategy and Cooperation at the Israeli Space Agency, will discuss the global trends of outsourcing strategic functions in the space industry and means for companies in different stages to capture value.
Thank you, Sarah, and hello, everyone. It's great to have you all join us for the Ilan Ramon conference today. As you know, this year's conference theme is Pivoting to Space, New Opportunities for Industries and Governments. We had to do some pivoting on our own as well because of COVID, and so the conference is fully online. It still gives us the opportunity to bring a lot of distinguished speakers from overseas that would be a bit harder if they had to travel all the way. I'm happy to host the panel, Government Outsourcing Procurement, Means of Capturing Commercial Value. My name is Gil Peleg. I'm a Senior Advisor to the Israeli Space Agency for International Strategy and Cooperation. And in the panel, we plan to focus on how can small and medium businesses overcome some of the barriers to entry into the space market. With me today are 3 great panelists. First is Mr. Dave Morrow from Lockheed Martin. Dave is a Senior Manager for Business Development, and he also has a significant track record in the space industry, both in engineering, advisory, and business development roles for over 30 years. Second is Mr. Steve Isley from Virgin Orbit. Steve is Vice President for Business Development. He also has quite a few roles in his track record under his belt in the space industry. And this is a great opportunity to say congratulations to Steve and the broader Virgin Orbit team for a successful inaugural launch earlier this month. And we can only assume how much it is exciting to be part of the team these days. And we hope to hear a bit more about it during the panel. Last but not least is Dr. Oren Milstein, founder and CEO of Stemrad. It's a high-growth startup based in Israel that produces radiation protective vests. Under Oren's leadership, Stemrad pivoted from building a product for first responders on Earth to also supplying protective equipment for astronauts in space. Stemrad did it through a joint venture with Lockheed Martin, which is a great example for how a small company can penetrate such a challenging market. And it's a great study that we're happy to learn from and discuss a bit more in the panel as well. So I think I'll start by saying, or actually thinking, why should we even have this conversation for the first place? Now, it's clear that there is a great opportunity for the private sector in the space ecosystem, and that opportunity is now. From governments that are outsourcing core capabilities, such as launches of satellites and even astronauts, through unique niches like the radiation vest that I mentioned earlier, growth is very visible in the space ecosystem, both in terms of upstream and downstream. We're witnessing aerospace companies with long heritage, such as Lockheed Martin, expanding their business in space. Companies like Virgin Orbit that are being founded with a very focused and core vision of disrupting the market with significant capital injection. And even startups like Stemrad that are working to capture their own niche within this blue ocean. But still, there's a disparity between the size of the opportunity and the number of companies that are pursuing it. In large, what we're understanding is that this disparity is because of a perceived barrier in the form of selling to governments. This is something that we'd like to discuss a bit more today. I'd like to suggest a quick and concise framework that might provide some clarity to companies that are either in the process or debating to enter the process of marketing their products and services to governments within the space ecosystem. Selling to a government in many ways is like solving a three variables equation. Variables of value, finding a champion, and a structure. Articulating the value is the first step. Usually it's fairly intuitive. The value of the product of the service should be demonstrated through objective KPIs, such as what is the cost savings, or what's the increased efficiency or productivity or safety. You need to name it and you need to be able to demonstrate it. But the bottom line is you need to answer the question of what's in it for the organization. The second step is building a relationship with a champion. This one is where things usually start to step outside of the comfort zone for traditional entrepreneurs. The goal of this phase is to identify who is the individual or what is the department within the organization that you're trying to reach that has either an existing responsibility or another incentive to promote the KPI that you understood that you're improving. In other words, you need to understand who from the client or a relevant partner can you bring on your team, and what position is he going to play in. Step number 3 would be identifying the right procurement structure. Now, I assume not too many people in the world are enthusiastic about procurement and bureaucracy, but as you know, the devil's in the details. And following the right procurement process can not only make or break a deal, but it also dramatically influences the sales cycle and the level of time and resources that you're going to need to invest in order to be successful. So with these 3 principles in mind, of value, champion, and structure, I want to open it up to a conversation from our panelists and hear some real life examples from their experience. So kicking it off with Dave, I think that everyone understands that Lockheed Martin is probably one of the most successful companies in doing B2G sales across the world. Can you share some best practices in identifying a champion within an organization? Do you have a playbook? And in what way is it different than the private sector, if at all?
Thanks, Gil, and thanks to Israeli Space Agency and to the Ilan Ramon conference for hosting us here today. Let me just say that the selling to the government is a complicated thing, and so one of the things that we do is part of our heritage is understanding who those customers are. And I think the biggest barrier that I would say is patience. An entrepreneurial company needs to have the patience to be able to understand that these things take time, and the first champion that you identify inside the government may or may not be the right one. You might have to move from one to another piece of an agency to understand whether or not your product actually fits within the need of the agency. I'll also say that part of what Lockheed Martin believes is that small companies like Stemrad, in this case, really can use a mentor. We've been doing this for a long time, and we understand our customers pretty well. And we can help advise and mentor companies like Stemrad and small companies like, back in the day, Orbital Sciences was a small company that we helped bring up from almost nothing. And now they're a powerhouse, part of Northrop Grumman. So there's a huge amount of relationship that we believe that needs to happen between the mentoring company and the entrepreneurial company to help both transmit technical knowledge, but also to be able to target the product to the market correctly. So I think the biggest barrier is understanding that market and having the patience to stick with it. I'll let Oren respond when it's his turn. These things do take quite a bit of time. The product cycle for something in the software industry is measured in weeks to months. The product cycle in the CubeSat portion of the space industry is measured in maybe months to years. The product life cycle in the case of the human spaceflight side of the aerospace sector is probably in years to decades. So you really have to understand that time cycle. You have to be patient. You have to be in it for the long haul. And you have to take advice that's sometimes not the easiest to take. And like just hold out, you rely on your other revenue sources, stay afloat, and we'll make this happen. So that's kind of some of the things that I would say an entrepreneur and a company ought to think about when they jump in. It's not for the faint of heart, and but at the end of the day, it's very, very rewarding. You can see Oren in the space station as we speak. So it's virtual background, but his product there, the AstroRad vest, is in the space station. That's it. It's part of the virtual background. So it's very, very rewarding. I can't imagine the joy that Oren felt when his product launched just a little over a year ago today. So anyway, those are some thoughts, and I'll turn it back to you, Gil.
Thanks a lot, Dave. And I think you're hitting the nail on its head when you speak about what I understand to be the balance between patience and a runway in terms of the funding of a company. And I also completely agree with your note about different revenue streams and different revenue sources, because as you plan for a long run, being able to organically sustain this long runway for the sales cycle and hedge it with other revenue streams, I think it's very important to be mindful in the initial phases of the process. So again, as you mentioned and sort of alluded to Oren's thoughts and comments about the joint venture with Lockheed Martin, I think that the combination of a startup that's very nimble and able to create innovation technology fast, together with established company like Lockheed Martin that already has the learning curve behind it in terms of who's who within the target organization and the distribution channel in place, I think that's a very effective one. So Oren, I'm interested to hear, now that the process has already been declared successful and behind you, as Dave mentioned, you have the AstroRad in space. What was the thought process on your end of the partnership in terms of entering the joint venture with Lockheed Martin? And what are the lessons learned that you've experienced through the journey so far?
Thank you, Gil. So STEMRAD was founded a few years before our partnership with Lockheed Martin. We had been focusing on protecting first responders to nuclear incidents. And we developed a product that's very successful in mitigating the effects of gamma radiation, and it's been deployed in reactors in Israel, in the US, and across the world. So we had the know-how of making wearable radiation protection. And then we also, had the childhood dream of being involved in space, like any other child who grew up in this era of humanity. Just to touch the stars is definitely an aspiration. That combined with the growing knowledge that NASA was planning to send people back to the moon, but this time to stay, and onto Mars even, and our internal understanding of the threat that imposed on the astronauts in the form of solar particle events, we realized that any kind of such mission would require very efficient radiation protection. So we looked at the big players in the field. We learned very quickly that Lockheed was the prime contractor for building Orion to take people back to deep space for the first time in 50 years. And we studied Orion. We looked at the shielding capabilities, and we looked at the deficiencies and where we can fit in with our wearable solution. And we saw a glaring need to help out Orion. And then we just ran into a solicitation by Space Florida. That's a funding initiative between Florida and the state of Israel. And we saw that they were looking for satellite components and a list of things that Israelis are known to be strong at. And we saw that Space Florida representatives would be attending. And we just, we basically stormed the meeting, and we had the great fortune of meeting two VPs of Lockheed Martin at the door there. And they just sat down with us, and one of them, John Karras, the head of the civilian space part of Lockheed, we just gave our 10-minute spiel of STEMRAD and our dream of protecting astronauts. And he bought into it. So he saw the people, he saw the idea, he identified the need, obviously. And since then, we've been working together with the help of these agencies that have been supporting us. So for us, I would say that the market still is here on Earth, but a lot of our motivation, a lot of our ability to recruit employees, to keep the morale high, originates from this collaboration with Lockheed Martin and with our involvement in space, not to mention the tremendous media exposure that we gained, and also a prestige and credibility to our products. And now we have a new product in hospitals that almost all of our marketing revolves around the space success. And the doctors keep on saying, these guys are working with NASA. They know what they're doing. So you have to tie everything in together. So for our company, we couldn't focus just on space. As generous as Space Florida and the Innovation Authority was, and later on, the Israeli Space Agency, which has been tremendously resourceful and helpful and generous. Still, you need to appease the investors. We are, profit-driven, and people like to see sales in the short term, not just in the long term. I try to pitch our sales 20 years forward, and it's not enough. They want to see a chart of 5 years forward, and for that, you have to show nuclear, you have to show medical. Yeah.
Thanks, Oren. And I think you also speak a lot about a lot of the benefits of working in space as part of a broader portfolio in terms of credibility, recognition, etc. Hopefully sooner rather than later, people in hospitals, even in the States, will say, you're working with the Israeli Space Agency. Wow, those guys know what they're doing. Let's buy your product.
They do. I can vouch for that.
But I think to tie up the conversation around STEMRAD and the joint venture with Lockheed, and really the symbiosis and combination of a startup and a prime contractor in a project like Orion. Dave, can you share a bit maybe what were the concerns early on after Oren gave his terrific pitch and spiel to Lockheed about partnering with the company at STEMRAD's profile, and how were those mitigated throughout the process?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the main concern had to do with matching the pace at which an entrepreneur works with the pace at which a government works. So that's the timing I mentioned earlier, and also the size. The size of something like the STEMRAD vest to Oren and STEMRAD was very large and very important. The size of something like that to a company like Lockheed is comparatively smaller. And so what I would say is that you need to have a motivated champion inside the large organization in order to keep things going, and to be able to remind folks inside the larger organization that, hey, this may not be huge in terms of revenue, but it's huge in terms of strategic value. And so I was fortunate enough to play part of that role myself. But as Oren mentioned, I had a vice president, John Karras, who was very enthusiastically supportive of that kind of thing. And inside Lockheed Martin, we have a Lockheed Martin Ventures Fund, which serves that purpose as well, that invests in small entrepreneurial companies to be able to bring products forward to the aerospace market. So I guess the bottom line is you need multiple champions. Your first question was champions inside the agencies. It's an important piece. The champions inside the inside the bigger company that can move things forward, retain the excitement, know how to work the system, frankly, inside the big company and the agency to keep things moving. That was a huge piece of our success. And then I guess the other thing that I'll say, and then I'll finish up, is you can't underestimate the enthusiasm and the technical competence of the entrepreneur. If you have an entrepreneur that is really awesome technically but dry personally, it's not going to sell so well. It's going to be hard to keep the excitement up. And frankly, it is an exciting thing that we're doing, and that has to be tangible in the communication from the entrepreneur. And then the technical competence, having an entrepreneur that repeats the same spiel over and over and over. We're going to go to orbit for less. We're going to go to orbit for less. And I just say that as an example. That gets a little old. These are really smart people you're dealing with, and to be able to say how a stem cell can regenerate, and to be able to bring in a Nobel Prize winner that can vouch for your product, that is huge. And an entrepreneur that says the same thing over and over is just going to get wearing, old, and get cast aside. I'll just say Oren and his technical officer, Gideon Waterman, were just outstanding in terms of being able to both communicate and also show the enthusiasm and technical merit of what they were doing. So a lot of pieces to that. So I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks a lot, Dave. And I guess that, building on your comment, both in terms of the champion to identifying the organization, but also you touched on the value issue of not only being monetary, also to Lockheed Martin, as it is to STEMRAD, the importance of such a strategic effort, and also bringing in the credibility to balance the young and entrepreneurial spirit. I think it's a terrific example for how it's done. I want to switch gears.
If I could say one more thing.
Sure.
I'm sorry, I should have said this at the beginning, but let me just give a shout out to your country, to Israel, to Startup Nation. One of the things that I will say was huge in our partnership was that this was sponsored by the ministry and the space agency. And, space exploration is an international partnership, and having another flag, having another country to be able to join that coalition, to be able to say, we're carrying forward the memory of Ilan Ramon. We are carrying forward the state of Israel's values. We're carrying forward the partnership that we have around the world. I will say that was huge, and I will say that that's going to be an advantage for any of your Israeli partners that are listening here today.
Perfect. Taken. Thanks. I want to switch gears and speak a bit about Virgin Orbit. We have with us Steve, which is VP of Business Development. And I think to start with, Steve, if maybe you can share a bit about the recent accomplishment and success story that we're all cheering for, about the successful launch for Launcher One. So maybe kick off with that, and then speak about the challenges you've had on the road from A to Launcher One being successful. So Stephen, if you can maybe share some insight, it would be great to start the conversation.
Absolutely. And it's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Gil. And thank you, of course, to the Ilan Ramon Foundation. Sad I can't be in Israel this year in person. Every year I've gone, it's been a wonderful experience. And as Dave said, I echo, space is all about international cooperation, and we have to support one another and get as many flags up as possible. So yeah, I'm thrilled to be here today. I mean, just on Sunday, January 17th, Virgin Orbit conducted their Launch Demo 2, which is their second attempt to get to orbit. And, I'm super excited and pleased to say that we had 100% mission success. I mean, we literally accomplished every single one of our goals, from the ground operations to smooth captive carry flight, terminal count, dropping that rocket, that beautiful candle, and lighting it into low Earth orbit, stage separation, second stage burn and relight, and then actually deploying the satellites into the correct orbit. I mean, so many things had to go right. As they say, a line of minor miracles occurred to come together to create this amazing day. And so we are so happy and thrilled that that happened. And thank you, Dave. And I mean, it's just, you know, it's a big celebration, socially distanced. We all toasted over Zoom, but it was just a fantastic moment. And, you know, the Virgin family is proud. And of course, we are thrilled now to be able to carry this forward into the next phase of the entire process. And so if I may, I'm going to just share one quick snapshot of that day. This that you see here is actually pictures from space. You see at the top, actually, the first stage light, you're just getting the curvature of the Earth. Then you see the separation in the middle, and then you can actually see the exposed payloads to space. So it's pretty awesome seeing an air launch system work like this. It was amazing. So we're really pleased to have done that, and we're looking forward to contributing, of course, to the next phase of the small satellite revolution, but also supporting our partners and just doing wonderful things and driving the economics of space, and also doing a lot of things for good and hopefully on an international level. So again, I wanted to just share that and express our excitement and thanks to everyone who supported this. Now to the topic at hand. The Virgin Orbit had quite an interesting path. We started officially as the Virgin Orbit in 2017, but we were part of Virgin Galactic before that. So a lot of the development was going on. And, it's always a tough road to hoe when you're a new startup, especially one that requires so much capital. And I think a lot that was said, certainly can echo, but when it comes to, penetrating government business and opportunities, you really have to approach it, from a multifaceted way. I don't think, just writing your business plan, your storyboard, of course, that is super important. But then the mistakes I see sometimes is that new space companies, especially startups, get really fixated on one office, or maybe they find that champion and they get really attached to said champion. And what you have to realize is, no matter what, one person alone can't do it within government. You really have to find a lot of different channels. And if you're a small startup, there are a lot of different ways to do that. First off, let's face facts. Whether you're a commercial new space company or a government-focused new space company or just in space, no matter what, you have to do business with the government. Whether, if you're going to space, you need licenses, you need all the regulatory support. Of course, they can prevent you from doing things in space. So you need the government, whether you think you do or you don't. So accept that. That's the first thing. The second thing then is, okay, how do we actually penetrate into getting government business? And that's really where this multifaceted approach, I think, enters. So the Virgin Orbit approach was, of course, going in and selling the world's most flexible launch system. We can do responsive launch. We can get you to any orbit inclination. Great. That's a good story, but the government kind of said, well, okay, that's nice, but let's see you do it. So I can say as of, a few days ago, we did it. But in the meantime, finding the right partnerships as well. So you need to find a champion in government, yes, but then don't be afraid to go to different agencies and entities. So space is now crossing over a lot of different agencies. So, you have the Department of Defense, you have NASA, of course, you've got international space organizations and government MODs. And being able to communicate effectively to all of them, just say, hey, I just want to let you know what I'm up to. I find this to be actually a pretty effective means of just kind of getting the word out and sort of level setting what it is that you do so that they don't, so there's, I would say no surprises, but not only that, you're providing sort of a level of advocacy and information. So you do have to kind of find targeted ways to get information out there. The second thing I would suggest, especially if you're a smaller company, startup without maybe, let's say, a lot of resources to have maybe lobbyists or government advocates in your capital city, for example, talking, reach out to, some larger companies like Lockheed, even like Virgin Orbit, and partner with us, because believe it or not, we are also looking at the new, great technology or new angle in which we can maybe do a study with, or we can get in the case of NASA, like a Space Act agreement to go do something. So you can actually, oftentimes, Virgin Orbit, we will sign on to things like tipping point proposals, which is a common feature in NASA, or even, support a small business set aside by providing letters of support or others in order to, get a small company a little bit of an edge, and or also help them open doors to some government partners. So I really think, we had help like this from some more established companies, and likewise, we provide a similar opportunity for some of the smaller companies. And, I get these requests all the time, and I will say we take them seriously, we look at them intently, and we're always happy to provide the support if it makes sense. Now, how can government, work for you? I can, of course, mainly speak on the US side, although we are collaborating a lot with MODs. But the US government in particular is looking more and more to outsource technology. It makes sense. They don't want to do everything themselves. And so, again, the level setting and informing them what you have, that's great. 2, putting in the right types of proposals or partnerships, which I always recommend, is another great phase. And then 3, there are ways that, let's say, don't cost money, but are incredibly beneficial, or maybe the government won't pay you, but they're incredibly beneficial to advancing your technology or to develop further. For example, Virgin we did Space Act agreements for like NASA Ames, NASA Marshall, and at Ames we used their flight simulator so that Cosmic Girl plane that we had, could go through all the different types of scenarios and conditions to better prepare our pilots. So, they didn't pay us to do that, but, we were able to kind of share, they were sharing their knowledge, their equipment. We were able to then kind of give them a little bit of insight about, the way that we do our concept of operations. NASA Marshall, I'll give as another example. They were a great supporter working with us on 3D printing and additive manufacturing. That's sort of a new trend in some of the aerospace. It's not that new, but I would say it's a hot trend in sort of aerospace manufacturing. And looking at additive manufacturing techniques, there's a lot of papers out there, scientific studies, but to actually be able to do it and come together and have things tested on a larger scale, or even just to utilize things like test stands, equipment, et cetera, we found that government partners are more than happy to work collaboratively with commercial entities in particular in order to advance a technology or a process, and it's a win-win for both sides. So I think presenting that, like, it's not just me taking from a government asset, but rather like, hey, if we can collaborate on this, or if you can lend me this time in your lab or something, then you will learn something that could advance things that NASA or whatever agency is involved in, and we get to advance further, on our technological pathway and make this a success even sooner. So there are certainly a lot of pathways to success. I can't say there's one necessarily right path. You have to figure out what's good for you, but there are ways to accelerate it through these types of, in-kind support, through partnerships. And then, of course, you have to do your homework and don't get so fixated necessarily on one entity or one agency. Spreading out a little bit is a good thing. And in fact, it ends up opening more doors throughout. So that's kind of, I guess, my brief bucketed advice and some of the lessons learned that we went through as a company.
Thanks again, Steve. I think these are great points. I think part reinforce previous ones that we've raised in the conversation. But I think you were very accurate and articulate to speak about the multifaceted approach and seeking partnerships and joint ventures. And really, I think that anyone that wants to do business in space is going to have to work with the government one way or another. So understanding it and trying to harness it to work with you instead of having sort of a tug of war over some issues, I think that is very helpful. You touched a point, and Dave also mentioned the value that the government can provide in sort of bringing more flags up there and providing sponsorship and also credibility to some of national startups, whether it is in Israel or elsewhere. So I want to circle back to Oren with this question. And again, full disclosure is that the initial process that STEMRAD went was before my tenure. So I'm also interested to learn, how did that process look like? Because in essence, you were able not only to work with Lockheed Martin, but to create sort of a consortium of government agencies from Israel and the United States to support you with funding. So what were the challenges that you had in terms of harnessing that support? and recruiting, quote unquote, the government agencies in the process?
Yeah, so I would say it's kind of like two sides of the same coin. So Stemrad needed to have the business partner, which was Lockheed Martin. And then also it needed to have the government partner for funding. And while on the business side, Lockheed was there from day one, and they ultimately helped us with the government side on the U.S. side of the operation. But on the Israeli side, so we had a couple of partners. The first was the Israeli Innovation Authority that provided the funds towards R&D. So really the basic science in the beginning. And that was through a venture with Space Florida, which funded the American side, namely Lockheed Martin. And so we developed the product across 2 or 3 years. And there the challenge was just in convincing the Innovation Authority and Space Florida that what we have here is a compelling case of a new technology that could bring dividends internationally to both places, Israel and Florida, through job creation was very important, but also through elevating the prestige of the nation or that area in the US, namely Florida, as far as involvement in space and technology. So it was a continual, I would say, very positive process of just renewing the grants time and time again, and keeping the fire alive. And we could do that. It wasn't easy, but we could definitely do that. And then ultimately, when we had a technology that was deployable or towards being deployable, that was the critical juncture in which I knew I had to approach the Israeli Space Agency. Being basically, Israel's conduit into international space, and the only way to move forward into the ranks of NASA was through the Israeli Space Agency, not to mention obtaining funding as an Israeli company. That would be the ultimate source of funding. So there it was just about really realizing the value that we created over the R&D process, translating that realization into intimate discussions with people within the Israeli Space Agency. And ultimately, I think the money time, so to speak, came when I spoke with the head of the Israeli Space Agency, Avi Blasberger. And we had a very productive and very exciting meeting that I won't forget ever. This was about 3 years ago, maybe a bit more. And there was an immediate sense of overlapping of interests. So we wanted to deploy technology that we had been developing with Lockheed Martin. Israel was interested in being involved in deep space manned exploration. Israel had been involved very much in depth in satellites, but not too much in the manned exploration since the passing of Ilan Ramon. So basically, I think there was an alignment of interests. Israel wanted to get back to working on the manned space missions, and we wanted to help those missions. So I think since then, it was just pretty smooth sailing, and it's been 3 or 4 years now that we've been working closely with the Israeli Space Agency. So you have a few hurdles that you have to pass. First, the innovation/R&D hurdle, and then to make it deployable. So you have an idea, make a technology. You have a technology, make it deployable. How do you make it deployable? You need the space agency on your side. So that's the process, and I would say it's still ongoing. We're just beginning. We're in the International Space Station. We're flying an Artemis 1 this year, and hopefully to be a part of the Artemis mission to the moon and to Mars, the manned missions. And from there to branch out also to private space. It could be Virgin Galactic, could be SpaceX, could be Blue Origin. So the sky is not the limit for sure. Yeah,
Definitely, and I think that you described it sort of two sides of the same coin, and in many ways I agree. Part of the value components that you spoke about and you mentioned are not necessarily monetary, the likes of prestige and job creation, etc. So I would say, in my words, that if you're working in a political environment, which in the end of the day, that's what government is, then there is a sense to political capital, which sometimes carries more weight than just money. and being smart about understanding those benefits as well, especially early on, can harness a lot of support and benefit.
That's right. The political capital. Yeah, having the Israeli flag on station, it played a big part, and rightfully so. It's a morale boost for our people, I think it's a big part of what we're doing is making people here on Earth feel better about their country, about what they're doing, for sure.
I want to sum up my lessons learned, and I've delved a lot about B2G sales, and I think that this panel and your great experience, I think it was able to emphasize and also bring new points to light. On the side of value, I'd say, in building on the last comment, it's not always about money. There are other ways to create value, and you need to understand what's the value you're creating and in what sense is it unique, right? Like Dave mentioned in the beginning, cheaper to orbit, cheaper to orbit, cheaper to orbit. So being different is not always only money, and being able to voice it clearly is something that's very important. And the second speaks about credibility, whether it's getting good advisors, good board members, good logos that are partnering with you, helps you once you're in the door to have what you're doing get the credibility. Again, assuming that it carries weight, right? Not to put that one aside, but that's key on value. On the champion side is that it's not only always one, and usually government offices have their rhythm of people changing offices and moving up the corporate ladder, and being patient and understanding that it's not only one is key. And also what Steve spoke about in terms of multifaceted approach, and not only working with one government and trying to get build a coalition that would support you, because in the end of the day there's a discussion and more than one individual sitting around the table, so try to have thumbs up from all of them. And in terms of the structure, so patience again is key. Be mindful about the sales cycle versus the burn rate versus your runway. But also, it's not a bad thing to look for shortcuts. In a lot of way, a partnership with a credible vendor that's already a prime contractor for a specific project is a great shortcut. And I think startups sometimes can underestimate the value that they can provide to a large partner in terms of the technology, in terms of the pace that they're working at. And this is a great example for 1 + 1 = 3 or more. So those are my lessons learned. Any additions from our great panelists about the conversations or thoughts to add or comments? Thumbs up is fine.
Oh, it's a great conversation. I just add the tying back to the international theme a little bit. More and more, we are seeing governments working now closely together internationally with technology security safeguard agreements, TSAs, for example. So the U.S. signed one with the U.K., and that really actually opened up access to doing more. For example, launching from the U.K. like we are at Virgin, but also just more cooperation in terms of sharing technology and communicating, enabling commercial companies to communicate to one another with, that may speak different languages and wear different flags. And I think that is an equally significant portion, is not to be afraid to use your government and to help, push them into doing these types of cooperative agreements, with other governments, and also in support of a lot of these space endeavors, because it is truly the, I think the universal medium that can bring people together is outer space.
Yeah, good.
That's great. I could add a couple of more words if I could. Gil, I think you've done a great job sort of summarizing into some cogent points how this conversation has gone. Let me just add one more thing. Our industry is going through a fair amount of change. We've got a lot of technology that's been out there that's starting to be deployed, that's cheaper and providing space access to many more countries and many more people. That's a huge change. And also some of those folks that have been in this business for 30 years, we're seeing a generational shift from the what we call in the States the baby boomers into the millennials and the younger generation. We at Lockheed Martin really want to facilitate that. And to your point of don't be afraid to reach out to a prime, there's a huge motivation on the part of companies like Lockheed Martin to be able to spread both the knowledge and also the mentorship in terms of building space into a much larger ecosystem. Oren mentioned going to the moon to stay with Artemis, which is what we're planning to do. But the way we'll stay is because there's a vibrant economic sphere with many more participants than just the government. And the way that we're going to do that is to bring people that are familiar with the government interactions like Lockheed Martin with people that are familiar with private sector interactions like STEMRAD and Virgin Galactic. So it's a big team effort, and we got a huge, bright future ahead of us. And I just want to say thanks again for including Lockheed Martin in this. And thanks to Oren for many years of both true friendship and also a wonderful partnership. Thank you very much.
So really, thank you, Dave, and thank you, Gil, for this opportunity. And it was a pleasure to meet you, Stephen. Just success. It's an exciting time to be a part of this community, and I've never felt it so vibrant like I'm feeling it this year. Actually, during COVID, especially, I feel like it's really uplifting our hopes and our spirits. So,
Terrific. Thanks, y'all, again for joining the panel. I hope it was enjoyable. It was definitely eye-opening for me and hopefully for the audience as well. And Sarah, back to you for the remaining of the conference.
Thank you, Mr. Peleg. This is a wonderful example of the fruitful collaboration between a large space company and a space startup. Next up, we discuss cyber in space. Cyber protection capabilities are key features to ensure independence and sustainability. In this panel, we will explore how to harness civilian cybersecurity capabilities and technologies to protect civilian space assets. Taking us through the topics is Mr. Ram Levy, founder and CEO of Confidus. Mr. Levy was the Israeli Prime Minister's secretary to the Israel Cyber Initiative. He specializes in the fields of space policy, space security, cyber policy, cybersecurity, and national security.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you very much for investing your time with us today. Welcome to the 16th Ilan Ramon panel on space and cybersecurity. My name is Ram Levy, and I'm the panel moderator. I'm the founder and CEO of Confidus. We are an Israeli cybersecurity company. Today, we have a fantastic panel on space and cybersecurity, where we'll be talking about the big trends and what we need to keep up and what you need to keep your eyes on that could directly impact your space assets. In brief, cyber attacks against satellite systems are computer-based attacks aimed at damaging a satellite system or system service. Satellite systems have become an indispensable for both military and civilian uses. As a result, weapons against space systems are a reality and a concrete strategic threat. Strategic threats to satellite systems and computer systems have long been researched as separate subjects. However, the close relationship between them require examining the nature and the extent of their influence on each other. Just to understand how large the problem is, there are currently almost 3,000 operational satellites in orbit, and to be exact, 2,787 as of this summer. Most of them are commercial satellites developed and launched by commercial industry for commercial purposes, and this trend is expected to grow. We see SpaceX planned Starlink constellation of more than 12,000 satellites. Amazon has a proposed constellation in the works, and the new space race continues its acceleration. In the last few months, we have seen a change in the operational environment for space operators, with more operators restricted to remote work, while the most vulnerable segment of satellite operations, the ground segment, is more exposed to cyber attacks than ever. Our goal today is that whatever your role is in the industry, you will come out with something new, a new idea, a fresh perspective, a new strategy that you can apply to protect your space assets. So here's the format, so it'll give you a little bit of an idea of what to expect. We'll take a few moments for each panelist to briefly introduce themselves and tell a little bit about their background in the industry. Then I'll kick off the conversation asking questions that draw some of the high-level themes and trends that we should be thinking about. Sounds good? Well, great. Let's start with the panel introduction. With us today are great people. And the first one is Lieutenant General Larry D. James, the Deputy Director of JPL at NASA. Dr. Dorit Dor, the VP Product of Checkpoint, Michel Brafman, the CEO and CTO of La Reunion Ariane and La Reunion Special, and Mr. Amir Einab, the CRO, Sales and Marketing for Karamba Security. So without further ado, I would like the participants to introduce themselves. So we'll start with the same order. So we'll start with you, Lieutenant General Larry D. James.
Thank you, Ram, and it's certainly a pleasure to be here today and really discuss this incredibly important topic of protecting our assets that are operating in space. I'm Larry James, as Ram said. I'm the Deputy Director and Chief Operating Officer for the Jet Propulsion Lab, which is NASA's federally funded research and development center here in Pasadena, California. Our job is to essentially do robotic exploration around the Earth and throughout the solar system. So as you can imagine, we have a host of spacecraft that are very concerning in terms of threat vectors and those sorts of things. In my past, in my Air Force life, 35 years in the Air Force, and I completed my Air Force career as the Chief of Intelligence for the Air Force. So as you might imagine, cybersecurity was high on my list as well in my Air Force career. So I will stop at that and look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much. Dr. Dorit Dor?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. I'm at Checkpoint 25 years, doing cybersecurity, managing the R&D and products all these years. Checkpoint is a leader in cybersecurity, network security, data security, these days mobile, cloud, IoT, and other stuff. Before Checkpoint, I was in the Army and intelligence unit, and I served 8 years. So I'm a major from the Army, and before that I graduated math and computer science. I have a PhD in a completely theoretical space that has nothing to do with this. And I'm passionate about space because a year and a half ago, I went to see a satellite launched to space in Russia, which was an amazing experience, and a few other kind of fun stuff around space. So it's my pleasure to be here and try to combine two very interesting topics, cyber and space. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Michel Brafman, to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. So in this panel, I am representing the insurance sensitivity to the issue. I've been in the insurance business for more than 25 years now. I've been for a very long time an underwriter on space risk. And then I have combined other tasks in the company, now being the Chief Operating Officer, and also participating in having a look at corporate level about emerging risk. And definitely cyber is one of them, not only for space, but also for applications in the aviation environment.
Thank you, Michel. And last but not least, Mr. Amir Eliav.
Hi, Ram. Thank you very much
Amir
for
Einab,
introducing me.
apologize.
Amir Einab, yes, I'm a Chief Revenue Officer for Karamba Security. So nice to be here. I've been with Karamba for 3 years now. Previously, 10 years at HP in various business units. In Karamba, I enjoy the growth and the change as we move from protecting connected vehicles to connecting other IoT devices, from solar panels to printers, and now in space. So it's an exciting opportunity to be here with this panel. Thank you very much.
All right, so without further ado, let's start with the panel. My first question goes to you, Larry. Everybody knows NASA, and everybody would like to know how protected NASA is. And I think the first question should be, were there some cybersecurity breaches and incident at NASA or JPL maybe, and how have you dealt with it?
Well, I think certainly like any large organization over the last decade or so, there have been breaches, and I think that's probably true for most organizations. We had a breach back in around 2010, 2011, which was attributed to China, where several gigabytes of data were exfilled. We also had a breach in the last 4 or 5 years where a foreign partner had malware associated with their account. They had access to our systems, and through that access, through the foreign partner's access, the adversary was able to get into some of our systems. Again, I think we've come light years from the early 2000s and mid 2000s, 2010 to where we are today, and I can certainly talk about that. And frankly, NASA writ large has also really moved light years ahead with respect to cybersecurity, because I would say, 15 years ago, civil space assets weren't thought about too much with respect to cybersecurity. We're doing science, we're doing things for the benefit of humanity, versus the military assets where you always wanted to protect them against a threat should you get into a conflict. And we know that the cyber operations will be one of the first things that happens in a conflict. So, but over time, you start to realize that everything is a target, and especially high technology is a target. So I'll go more deeply into that later in terms of what we have been doing the last 10 years and really in the last 5 years in terms of strengthening our boundary protection and strengthening how we operate from a cyber perspective. But certainly we've had breaches, certainly we've had data exfilled, but over the last decade, I would offer that probably we've all experienced that at one form or another.
Dorit, you at Checkpoint, you're witnessing many types of attacks. What can we learn from the difference between terrestrial attacks and attacks against IoTs and space-based assets?
Yes, that's a very good question. I think that if you look at the things around us, so we could learn from actual attacks and we could learn from vulnerabilities. We have a large research team that spent part of its time to understand attacks possibilities and help secure things. So we've attacked in our past DJI drones, we have attacked Fortnite game, we've demonstrated how to use Alexa and how to send you a picture through Instagram that will attack you, etc. And I think that one of the things about all this is that the attack doesn't necessarily start from the core component of the thing. It finds some entry spot in the system, oftentimes a web page or an interface to a user or something else. So I'd start by asking space entities, how is their ground station doing in terms of security? Because that would be the first part to attack. So obviously we could go to the sky directly, but it starts kind of at the ground, even if we talk about space. So when you need an entry point, you would look for the easiest entry point that you can. The other thing I would say that is a challenge that you could learn from other spaces into space is that oftentimes it's very hard to get rid of things. Many years back, we published a research called Misfortune Cookie. We found out that we could, with one packet, attack 12 million routers on the internet and take over them. These were different vendors' routers, and the only common ingredient they had is that they had underneath them a chipset that had a freeware web server that was the web server for this router. And so this free web server had a vulnerability that was found out a few years before we found it out again. And it was known and published, but nobody would change the freeware server inside the chipset, inside the router, because how would you update that? So when we went to do a full disclosure of this option, we start to talk about the routers with telcos, etc. And the best they could say is, okay, we will announce this router end of life. But how good does this do to security if you just announce it end of life? So the other thing that's common to some of the attacks is that sometimes they have a component that are long-lived in the same place, and it's very, very hard to change them. So I think these were two kind of good examples of things you could conclude from one to another.
And do you think that those principles that apply to terrestrial systems can apply to space systems?
Yes, definitely. So I would say that if a space system had some vulnerability inside, it would be very hard to get rid of it, just like a router in my parents' house. Nobody would invest in replacing. In space, it would be hard to get rid of it from another reasons.
Or even impossible.
Yes, and the main problem is that it's a system that starts from the ground, has many entry points, and end in space, and you have to look at all the system. So when you try to analyze it, you shouldn't just look at what's on the satellite or what's on the space, whatever. You have to look at the whole system and find your weaknesses. And it's just so much easier to find weaknesses in some low-hanging fruit in other places than just to attack the specific components in space. So I see no good reason that it would be different in space. And the thing that it stays there forever is something to be worried about in terms of protecting.
And Ram, if I could just comment on that real quick, and I'll amplify later, but Dorit is exactly right. The ground system is extremely important, and we can talk about that. That is an obvious point of entry. And then secondly, her point to it's hard to get rid of things. We have operating systems that we've been using. For example, the Voyager spacecraft has been operating since 1977. Yeah. So you can imagine the original operating system that we designed to operate that spacecraft. And it's very difficult to make changes to that. It's very expensive, and the programs don't necessarily have the dollars to do that. So those are very good points, and we can delve into those much deeper as we go forward. But I just want to certainly amplify what Dorit had said on those two key points.
By the way, the satellite launch I saw was launched by a Soyuz 2 missile, and you know how many years the Soyuz 2 missile lives. Just another example for the long live of ingredients that participate in this game.
Well, the large launch that I saw was Bereshit, and you can imagine the short life of the ingredients.
Yeah, that's a counter example, but it's unfortunately not very representative.
Absolutely. Amir, from your perspective, speaking about protecting space systems, what in your view are the critical elements that require protecting, and how should we do that?
So it's a great question. I think and following the discussion earlier, there is the ground station element, and I think in a way, like Dorit was alluding, this is a major area to be protected, and it's an major attention naturally. But really, the uniqueness here is, of course, that the fact that the device or the connected embedded device, like we like to call it in Karamba, is out there in space. It's as remote as it gets. You cannot just send an engineer to change something. You cannot just easily handle it over the lifetime, and it's supposed to last. I don't know. Voyager is kind of a unique example, I think, but maybe 10 years or so, or maybe more. And one of the elements that when we think of the risks of those space systems is that today more and more developers, and especially the commercial side, as they're coming on board, will try to use typical, normal. They won't develop their own OS. To Larry's point, that's not going to happen these days. Now it's going to be normal IT technologies as much as possible, but still they're going to be very remote. There's going to be there for many, many years, and it's going to be very difficult to handle any issues, which will be there because they're going to be there as always. So I think that's the uniqueness of the space architecture. Also, if we're looking at the satellite itself, there is now the element of bus software versus payload software. So there is different players involved in the satellite itself. So there is an element of supply chain. So the device itself has now a supply chain aspect, which, as we saw recently in the recent attack, supply chain is a major challenge also here on simple Earth.
Absolutely. Well, the shift from protecting the satellite to protecting the space system, I'm sure it has also a visible effect on the insurance industry, Michelle. I would like to know, how does the insurance industry see the ability to transfer the risk or insure not only the satellite, but the space system as a whole? And do you have a solution for us on whether this is an insurable risk or not?
That's a big question. We're not sure. We're not sure to which extent it can be insured. Well, just to be a little bit technical on our side, we are used to differentiate health risk and liability risk. So when we insure satellites for damages, that will be about the indemnification for the degradation or the destruction of satellite capability. And when we are talking about liability, it's more associated with a service, where everywhere there is a business, there is a service. And here it's about the damage which are suffered by customers or by people who are depending on the signal that is transferred by the satellite. When we want to insure for damages, which we have done for ages now, we need to understand and assess the risk. And on this, we are, as you know, Ram, because you are part of our discussions, we are, I must say, a little bit confused about the extent to which we can insure. When we are in the cyber risk, we need to think about attackers. And here, to us, it is like, it is a warlike type of risk that we are considering. Usually, we are insuring against technical defects or faults or end-of-life issues with equipment. Here, having to deal with offensive intentions from attackers is a little bit outside of our usual perimeter of action for the insurance. So this is why we try to characterize and identify what is accidental and what is intentional, even if it is from an attacker's viewpoint.
So when you come to insurance space assets, to what extent do you understand the cybersecurity and the architecture of the insured asset?
So on this, we are not the experts. So we need the support of experts like you, Ram. Since we are not in the usual assessment of risk about the quality of the system or the testing of equipments in space conditions. One of the questions that we need to ask ourselves is whether, first of all, systems. You can have very old satellite architectures with very old and unprotected softwares or hardware environments where you can suppose that there is more vulnerability than on state-of-the-art equipments. Well, military grading is, of course, the top, but this is not our usual business. We are dealing with civilian satellites, basically. So it is hard for us to understand which is more vulnerable and what is really the true difference of vulnerability between all of these systems. And also something which is puzzling for us still at this point is who would have an interest in attacking a civilian system. We know that civilian systems are attacked every day in the world, including hospitals. This is very disturbing, and we need not to consider that satellites are going to be immune from attacks. But what is the motivation of these attackers, and what is the balance of cost and opportunity for them to do this? We suppose that it costs a lot to launch an attack against a satellite system because it is more sophisticated than most of the Earth-based equipments. And we are familiar with the idea that normally it must go through the ground bases, the ground infrastructure, the ground equipment, which is the normal entry point to the satellite system. But beyond that, I must say, it is very much a question of expertise on the architecture of satellite systems. And from our own experience, long experience on analysis of satellite risk, we are missing a lot of clues. So we need the support of experts, and we cannot be the experts ourselves.
I think that one of the things in cyber is that The fact that something has been long-standing doesn't mean that it's safe. So we recently published a wormable vulnerability in a Windows DNS server that was 17 years in the code. So you are not immune if you are there for a long time. And also the other element of not knowing what would be the motivation of the attacker. I think we saw that with recent attacks, for example, attacker due to a supply chain attack was able to attack many organizations. I'm not sure they were even inspired to attack all these organizations that they could have attacked. But now that they all of a sudden found a huge portfolio of attacks that they could do, and now I'm sure they selected some for prestige and some for kind of specific data and some for future tools, etc. So I think that it's also an issue of opportunity. And once the opportunity comes to play, it's very fabulous to attack a satellite, especially if you are kind of the first one to do a fabulous attack on a satellite.
Exactly.
You
It's
could
all
win
about fame.
you could win great fame points. So I'm not sure that just kind of the motivation by itself is enough to explain if it will be attacked or not, especially if there are low-hanging fruits. So if it's well protected, it's one thing, but if there are low-hanging fruits, somebody would come.
I think that one of the conclusions that we had from our research we've done at the Tel Aviv University with the International Space University is that the further you move away from the ground station and the satellite itself, which is operating the satellites, and you go to the service providers using the satellites, they are much more vulnerable. And therefore you can hit them without investing much in comparison to the ground stations that are held, let's say, by militaries, for example, which brings us to the very heavy subjects of supply chain attacks, because satellite-based systems are supply chain-based systems. I mean, it's all one big supply chain. So maybe, Dorit, you can follow on and tell us what can we learn from the recent supply chain attacks, and what are the key takeaways for protecting ground stations in that regard?
Well, so it's not, unfortunately, there isn't like a magic answer. You just, put this spray of security and it protects everything. So this is not, unfortunately, a good answer. But you could go back to good old methods of security, and you could do security by architecture and do a very tight zero trust kind of architecture. So it may have not been saving you from getting the bad software, but it would have saved you from getting the bad follower on the software installed on the machine if you had a very tight zero trust model. And then the next step would be to understand behavior and anomalies, and obviously servers or any kind of IoT. You could think of satellite as IoT, but any tight server as an IoT that changes its behavior and all of a sudden start to talk to all kinds of entities that didn't talk before, or users that start to be used in a way that they weren't talked before, are very good way to get a hold of these attacks. But then the next challenge is to really do it in prevention. So one of the problems here is that the attacker can move very fast, and you may find yourself after fact when you were already affected. So the challenge is to do these technologies in the way that you are preventive upfront. Then there are other more sophisticated forms of supply chain that didn't necessarily witness in this attack, but when you start to use open source code, we've seen injection of open source code to other open source code projects, and that getting used by other innocent players. And these are all also things you could protect. You could protect kind of developer systems from injecting code to some level, obviously. So there are a collection of, I would say, industry best practices, but I think you had to apply all of them to get really protected in such cases. And it's not an easy task. So you don't expect this to come from your
from inside.
From the side, yes. So it's getting people by surprise.
Yeah, Larry, I was actually wondering what is NASA doing in that regard, because this task is, I think it's even more difficult than launching a satellite.
Right. And I think as Dorit said, I mean, it is multi-layered and it's multifaceted. So there is not a silver bullet. There's not the spray you can put on and it fixes everything. But some of the things we're certainly doing, and again, I think it's a process. Let's take the ground system. Our ground data system, those that are already operating, for example, our rovers on Mars, our spacecraft already orbiting the Earth. What do you do to just protect those even from supply chain problems? And one of the things we've done is, as she said, we start to layer in monitoring capability on those ground data systems, which are looking for anomalous behaviors, which the normal ground data system engineer, it's not going to send up a red flag on his system. He wouldn't normally see it in the ones and zeros scrolling on his screen, but you can train the software and you can understand the history and start to develop using AI and machine learning what is anomalous, even though it may not trigger something, but this looks a little different. So we've started to embed that capability into a lot of our ground data systems, even for our extant missions, those that are already flying. And frankly, we've seen a lot of better understanding by our ground data system engineers to say, wow, I didn't realize that this system is starting to do this. I don't know if that's nefarious or not, but now I can go take a look. So I think that is point one, that yes, you're not preventing it, but you're monitoring so that you get ahead of the problem before somebody does something and you suddenly have data pinging out that you didn't realize. Number two, I think, is kind of designing hardness in, and that's another area we're really working with our ground data systems engineers and our flight software engineers on the spacecraft, is how do you think about hardening your design so that even if there is some attack vector that gets in through some supply chain problem, the design you've built is much harder against that type of attack from a flight software perspective on the spacecraft, as well as within the ground data system itself. And there's mechanisms and ways to do that. I don't claim to be the expert on all the tools that we have, but we are training our people that are doing the initial design for these new systems we're building to be much less susceptible to those types of problems. So those are just a couple of avenues that we're working on.
But I'm pretty sure that the more you introduce security requirements, the more it puts a burden on the missions. How do you solve the tension between mission deadlines and mission security requirements, and making sure that the security requirements do not impose any risk on mission critical assets?
Well, that's a good question, and I'll be honest. A year ago, there was kind of this, discussion between the missions and the security acquirers, saying, "Well, wait a minute. I don't want you to put this on my ground data system. It's going to slow things down. It's going to interrupt how I do my operation." I think for the current systems, we're beyond that. For the new missions that were coming down, we worked with NASA writ large, and they did a large study over the last year that essentially laid out cybersecurity requirements for the missions. And there were a bunch of recommendations in there. And now that's going to be kind of a part of the standard process. So as we go through all of our gate reviews, as we call them, the key decision point reviews, you go through preliminary design review, critical design review, all those sorts of things. That will be a component of the review that you must show that you've addressed the cybersecurity threat, how you've done that, what does your design look like, and that will be kind of one of the pass-fail criteria as we go through these reviews. So it's really coming from the senior levels of NASA that say, look, we have to do this, and then we have to accommodate the schedule and costs that go along with that. Ideally, it's not a big hit, but it just has to be a part of the process, just like any other part of the review. So that's just really getting started. And in fact, we've just started defining the flight project cybersecurity requirements here at JPL. We've now written those down, and we're having the missions start to, really use those to develop their missions.
That's good news because, yeah.
There are architectural things that you could do, that you should do. So you should design the architecture with enough kind of segmentation, even if segmentation is not always the right word for this type of activity, and with a certain level of updatability, because you would never assume that you could know upfront all the risks that there are. So if you build it so that it would have security ingredients in the right places, then you could later handle them. And if you build very tight, very only current security into this, it's likely not to stand out in the view of time. So you have to architect it in a way that it's in there, but it's somehow updatable and flexible to be used at a later time with something that you don't know today.
Amir, in your view, are there any? How can the industry contribute to solve this issue?
So I want to refer to what Larry was saying in terms of this conflict, it happens in all industries, and it's great to hear that the NASA and the powers to be actually start to looking into it and understanding that there is this conflict between the scheduling, the cost, the performance, all these metrics that they're always being measured on, versus this new thing, which is cybersecurity. And like Michelle said, what is the cost of cybersecurity? How do we calculate that? In insurance, it's calculation, right? How do you calculate that? And I was just wanted to add into context of this conflict is it's not, we all talk about and we all know it's about defense in depth, and we need to have multi-layers of security, and every layer we're adding, it's making more difficult for the attacker, if it's for fame or for money or for nefarious reasons that are more significant than that. It makes it more difficult for them, and they will not come for these systems if they see it's difficult, and it's an ever continuous battle, right? You don't just put a system in, that's it, it's secured, you can go to sleep. You always will come up with the next technology, because they will come up with their next technology of how to attack it. It's fine. We all, everybody in the cybersecurity space, funny, sorry for the pun, it's like this, right? That's how it works. I think for us in Karamba, when we looked at in other embedded connected devices, which also face the same challenges in terms of the logics of the business, it's always about how little and how seamless cybersecurity can be, how less burden on the system it can be, then the value shines, right? And in that context, I think there is different companies, different focuses, again, the defense in depth suggests that there is different players focusing on different areas. We decided to focus on the endpoint itself, so the satellite in this architecture, right? I will assume, in my world, I would assume the ground station will be compromised at some point. The service providers that was mentioned here, they will be the easy access point. So when they will come to this satellite, can I protect it at that point? And as Dorit said, it's prevention, it's monitoring, there is multiple layers that you can put on the device itself. But going back to my point, the challenge is to do this seamless. So the satellite can still operate within its boundaries in terms of performance, in terms of the scheduling of the whole mission, make it the cybersecurity as seamless as possible.
Larry, you've mentioned that you've developed new recommendations that are part of the preliminary and critical design review. And I think that's a question also for Michelle. Do you think it's the lack of international regulation on cyber that actually kept this whole business behind? That nobody really told anyone what to do, unlike, for example, the banking systems or critical infrastructure?
Larry, do you want to take this?
I think it was to you, Michelle. I mean,
okay, sorry. So, well, that's one of the key element of the situation, which is the absence of regulation on cyber aspects. Well, there are some bilateral cooperations between allies. But it's mostly a government thing. It's not a private. Companies would cooperate, but usually within the or under the umbrella of governments. And unlike in other type of military questions, there isn't much cooperation, as much as I understand. So it's it's a jungle, basically. And as far as space is concerned, we can observe that it is not very much regulated as well. Well, there are some international treaties which have set a few fundamental aspects a few decades ago. Nothing has been revised, nothing has been updated in relation with the development of the space use. So it is another type of jungle, if we can say so. And here, well, when we talk of pharmaceutical industries, which is a target for cyber attacks or many other activities, there are regulatory frames that apply, and there is some sort of cooperation because there is an understanding that there is a common interest of cooperating at a minimal level, even between adversaries. But as far as space is concerned, we don't see that as well. So cyber and space do cumulate a combination of what I would call well, wilderness. It's a double. It's to the square, wilderness to the square, and it doesn't help. It doesn't help to read the situation. It doesn't help to anticipate how it can evolve. So that's really, in our view, that's an additional challenge that we need to tackle.
Michel, but in order to launch or to operate the satellite, you need to have a government licensing you that. So it's basically what you're saying is that the governments who are licensing space operators or are permitting the launch of satellites should require cybersecurity as part of the launch or the space operation segment.
Well, you know, space is there to provide a service. Well, space is not space per se. Especially when we talk of commercial space. So you deliver a signal. It's for telecommunication. It's for observation. It's for the GPS applications. Well, you've got many sort of applications, and the more time goes, the more there are applications. And the regulatory frame is not brought by space itself. Space is a sort of chameleon, if we can say so. When you have an application of space going to aviation, for example, to assist for the ATM, for the civilian aviation applications, then you will fall within the frame of the aviation regulations. If you have a GPS application for marine, for example, for big cargo company or for ferries, it would be the law or the regulatory environment of marine applications, and so on. If it's telecommunication, it's going to be the telecommunication environment. So space as such has no identity. And it is not structured by itself. It is structured by the applications to which it is brought to offer solutions. And this is maybe one of the reasons why it is so difficult to regulate, because it is just coming as an additional facility to bring new solutions to all problems, but as such, it has no unicity.
And do you think the solution could be to condition the granting of space operators license by complying with some kind of cybersecurity requirements?
Well, that's one of the options. Well, if we take a comparison with aviation, aviation has not very much regulated the cyber aspect as well. Well, now it is on the move. There are more and more initiatives at international level. So everybody understands that there is a need to cooperate on that to protect the safety and the security of operations. Both aspects need to be covered. So there is more cooperation on safety than there is on security, but there is a cooperation. So here you will see more and more going forward regulations which will be imposed not only on airlines, but also on manufacturers, on companies which provide service for the maintenance of the aircraft. This is going on. This is moving on to respond to a global a global target of maintaining or even improving the level of safety of aircraft operation. But as far as space is concerned, we are just talking of machines. So the level of sensitivity to the issue is really not the same. Well, if you break one of these big expensive machines, it is still a machine. You are not going to have to indemnify tens or hundreds or thousands of victims, except if you can.
The sun goes down, no?
If you can interfere with one of these services where the life of, for example, airplane passengers is threatened, there you can have an indirect effect. But when it happens, then the whole mindset will be changed. But first, I'm afraid we have to see it. Otherwise, I don't see it changing very much.
I think that
Dorit, you want to comment? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that sometimes IoT devices are used to attack other things. So just looking at what do they attack that you provide as a service doesn't answer the whole kind of liability. And again, I'm not an expert on insurance, but what if you are being used to attack somebody else? And it's not hurting the service that you intended to give, but it's hurting the other systems in a fatal way. And especially if you go to software-defined satellites, and now you could build an independent satellites for components of existing satellites by software redefining them to do something else that you want. So now you created your own new machine in space that you could use to attack other things, just as an example. So the attack surface is not just whether you turn it into a stone and it's useless, or whether you didn't provide the service that you intended to provide. There is also what if you were used to do something bad?
And that's definitely a scenario that we need to take into account. We are in. Excuse me, Amir?
No, I wanted to mention that the discussion on the regulation is very, very relevant. If you take from another industry like automotive, they were talking for years. But then this year in 2020, they finally came up under the UN ECE organization. So it's not, they're not the Americans, but the EU, China, Korea, Japan. And they are now basically in 2022 will have a type approval. You won't be able to put a new car on the road without showing what did you do in cybersecurity. So it takes time. I understand everyone, but eventually, if the regulators are stepping in, it's definitely impactful.
Yeah, well, regulation has always been the biggest driver for change in cybersecurity. Regulation and attacks. We are about to wrap up, so I would like to have a quick round of final comments from you, so we can start with the same order that we began. Maybe we'll start with you, Larry.
Sure. Well, thank you, Ram. And again, I think the panel has shown that it's a complex issue, it's a multifaceted issue, and it requires really protection across a broad spectrum. And I think that's what we are trying to think about. And I'll just end by saying, we are now saying, look, when you start to formulate a project or a mission, you must be thinking about cyber. And that's really where you start to bake in the design and you start to think about the architecture, as Dorit said. And so we're telling our folks, look, at the very beginning, when you think about the next mission, the next project, you must think about the architecture for cybersecurity, the tools you will use for protection, and the agility you need to have, to Dorit's point, that these things last 10, 20, 30 years for us. So how do you make sure that they can be capable of protecting themselves, or we can upload new protections and software or whatever in the future? So that's the road we're going down, in addition to the requirements as you go through each checkpoint to make sure you're meeting these requirements internally. but we're forcing our folks to think about the design upfront and make sure they're trained to understand how do you harden upfront with the design. And that's the path we were going to have to live with for the decades ahead. So that's my kind of closing thought on that, Ram.
Excellent. Dorit.
Yeah, I think that if I learned something in many years of the cyber industry is that types of attacks evolve in a kind of, first they are light below the radar, you don't notice them, so you see a few options to do it, and you could imagine how it will be done, and then at some point this becomes a mainstream weapon. Because it becomes easy, because other ways were closed up by the time it reaches that. So there is a maturation level of the attack landscape. So it starts by kind of being few, very little on the sides, something not really noticeable, and then at some point it hits in a bigger way or become a more mainstream form of attack. And because space is there to stay, and we said equipment is there to stay, we ought to look at this upfront and to build it so that we would be ready. And we shouldn't assume that what we know today that the attack surface will be, it would be exactly that. So we have to come to it very flexible in terms of the architecture that we bring in.
100%. Michel?
So I can only insist on the ultimate need for internationally accepted regulations. In the absence of such regulations, which must have sanctions provision in case of misbehaving, the only deterrence against serious attacks or attempts is actually the threat of retaliation. So it can only lead to escalation. And behind the scene, I understand this happens every day. But for the satellite industry, this is not what is needed. Space and satellite, civilian satellite applications do not need to become a battleground. And ultimately, if we do not have regulations, internationally accepted regulations, we may see some effects, some undesirable effects of this.
Amir?
Yeah, so for me, this is an exciting space. Definitely, this is an emerging one that, it's something that calls for all the ingenuity and all the tried and true technologies of security by design and strong embedded controls, everything we know already, but there are uniquenesses in this area that are definitely requiring additional research and additional alignment of the technologies with specific characteristics of the system. But I think for me, the main point is that I learned a lot, and it was a lot of fun to be panelist in your panel. So thank you very much for inviting me and having this great session.
Yes,
well, with this tune, I'd like to say thank you very much to you. It has definitely been a great panel. I've learned a lot from what's going on at NASA, and from you, Dorit, and Amir, and of course, Michel. And I hope that by next year, we will meet again and we will hear that we have taken a bigger step in securing our space assets. So without further ado, I'm bringing it back to the studio, to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Mr. Levy. As we heard from the panelists, cybersecurity is critical to develop space assets. Now, next on the agenda, space business expands into new markets. As humanity expands into the solar system, space will be an essential component in creating a sustainable environment on Earth. In this session, we will review two trends: how space technologies improve our lives on Earth and how space technologies enable independent life in space. We will discuss the business models that will allow these trends, how to expand into new markets and bring new players into the space arena. This topic is moderated by Mr. Frank Salzgeber, Head of the Innovation and Ventures Office at the TIA AI. Mr. Salzgeber is overseeing the largest space entrepreneurship network in the world. His team has initiated over 360 industry transfers and has supported nearly 1,000 startups.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and welcome, dear audience, to a great panel. We speak about space business expansion into new market, and I heard already and saw titles of presentations where we say it's the decade of space. And today on that panel, we have exciting entrepreneurs, people which are really in the market and change the market. My name is Frank Salzgeber. I'm Head of Innovation Ventures at the European Space Agencies. And my office is taking care of supporting startups since over 1.5 decades. And we support about 230 startups a year across Europe. Some of these companies we do not support, and it's a pity because they're driving innovation and they drive space into new markets. And we want to share with you with an interesting discussion what will be changing and what will go on. Anyhow, it's not about me. It's not about ESA. However, we are great to be part of this great Congress which we have today. And maybe I give already the floor to the panel to introduce themselves, what they do and what they change and what they're working on. And I would like to give first the floor to Amir. Amir, what is about commercial space? Build you a new space station, or we hear a lot of press and we hear a lot of advertising where you tell us who you are and what are you working on?
Sure. Thanks, Frank. Thanks for giving such a great opening, and thanks for Israel Space Week for having us all on. My name is Amir Blackman. I'm the Chief Business Officer of Axiom Space. We are the company that offers missions to the International Space Station today and are building the new space station that will be the successor to the International Space Station. We have a lot of exciting stuff going on now and in the coming years. In the nearest term, we will fly our first crew of 4 people to the International Space Station in 11 months. And we will fly the first module of our new space station to space to connect to the International Space Station in 2024. And we are in the midst of closing our second large funding round, and we'll be making formal announcements about those milestones in the coming few weeks. So keep your eyes and ears open.
Amir, thank you so much. We now move to another colleague, Namirian, which is from India. India Space, New Space India Limited, forgive me for that, fostering new space. Tell us what you're doing. I think it's a great endeavor you're working on. You have a great nation, you have great projects. What is the news? What are you doing?
Yeah, myself, Narayanan, from the New Space India Limited. So far, you would have heard about Indian Space Research Organization, ISRO, who had been spearheading the space activities in the country. And the country right now is going through an exciting phase through a reform process that has been announced by the government. And in that context, my company is all set to take over all the operational systems which ISRO had been providing so far, and we will continue to provide the services which ISRO was hitherto doing. ISRO will focus primarily on the research and development, the planetary missions and other scientific missions, whereas the operational systems will be taken over by us. The reform process is also more exciting with a lot of openings for the private sector as well as the startups, which I will cover during my subsequent talks. I am heading the company as the chairman and managing director of the company. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Interesting ideas. A spin-off from a government organization. Maybe I should go back to it and say, okay, how they spin off ourselves. So, and make myself redundant. There's no innovation in startups without fuel, and the fuel in the system, of course, is financial. It's financial support we see in financial market. And I think, Raphael, that's the area where you come along.
That's right, Frank, and it's good to see you. It seems like we see each other once a month on these space conferences, and that by itself, I think, is a very good sign for the sector. Not necessarily because it's me talking, but that we have all of these conferences. That's right. My main activity is I invest in space companies at the seed stage through my firm E2MC, which stands for Earth to Mars Capital, and we do that worldwide. My other activity, though, is, as you said, Frank, we need money to get people to build the space economy, but we also need people. We need entrepreneurs, we need other investors. And that's the other thing that I'm doing. That's why I'm doing space outreach. That's why I'm here today. That's why I'm speaking at other space conferences. I recently published a book, an introductory book on the space economy, similar to Robert's book, which he's going to talk about, I'm sure, in a second. And I also host a bi-weekly podcast, which is called the Space Business Podcast.
Thank you so much. And we spoke about books, we spoke about outreach, and I think, Robert, you just were writing a book. Space is open for business, which I was believing already a long time, and still hammering in that direction. But I think now with your publication, Raphael's publication, others, everybody really gets it. So Arc Mission, Robert, what are you doing?
I think so much, Frank. Well, Frank, I'm Robert Jacobson, and you're actually in my book, and I know and I know Amir's also, I think, in it as well, and Axiom is represented. Robert Jacobson here. I'm a serial entrepreneur, and I describe myself as a business developer, an enabler, and author of Space is Open for Business. Some of the current concurrent businesses that I'm working on is Space Advisors, a consulting company. Galactic Legacy Labs, which is taking a time capsule to the moon later in 2021 with via Intuitive Machines. I'm also a member of the crew on Arc Mission Foundation, which is a not-for-profit backing up Earth civilization. We've flown several times, most notably inside Elon Musk's Tesla Roadster and with Space IL on the Beresheet. And we're going to be flying with Astrobotics Peregrine lander later this year, and also co-founder of Aerospace Defense Forum, and have a couple other things that are just a little more below the radar at the moment. But thank you so much for having me today.
I think it's our pleasure to have you all. Last but not least, somebody has to bring the payload up into the sky and into low orbit and to orbit. And I think, Shane, that is where you come along.
That's correct. Thank you, Frank, and thank you to the Israeli Space Agency for hosting us here, my fellow panelists. My name is Shane Fleming. I'm the VP of Global Commercial Launch Services for Rocket Lab. I've been with Rocket Lab for 6 years and responsible for all of our commercial sales. Rocket Lab, we're very fortunate. We've had 17 missions to date, launching 96 payloads to orbit for our customers. We're going to be launching our 18th mission tonight, which we're very excited about. We had a great year in 2020. We launched 7 missions successfully, and we've launched our first Photon satellite, which we're very excited about. We also recovered our first stage 1 booster, bringing us one step closer to reusability. And we've also joined forces with Sinclair Interplanetary, which is very exciting because that allows us to offer very exquisite reaction wheels and star trackers. So we largely see small launches solved, and we're moving up the value chain to be able to offer satellite bus solutions, mission operations, and spacecraft components along with our bundled launch offering. So very excited to be here today, and thank you to Frank and our fellow panelists for connecting virtually.
Thank you so much. And I go right away to one of the questions, because it's not only about technology, I heard, it's also about the change of the business model. And I think all of you have a kind of answer to that, which I would like very much to know and to share it with our audience. What are really the changes in the business model, beside going maybe from governmental to entrepreneurs like you? But what really has the impact? And what is your answer related to that? Who wants to take that?
Sure, I'll jump in. As someone who sort of is going to need groups like what Shane and Amir are providing, I think we're seeing this great infrastructure, and infrastructure could be transportation infrastructure, could be habitat infrastructure, and those pieces are going to allow many entrepreneurs and, of course, and not-for-profits and governments and academics and other to, I think, thrive and create really awesome applications that are going to be inspiring and useful for us on Earth. I think that's kind of the key driver that I see for, and inspired by the work that groups like Rocket Lab and Axiom Space. And also I see it's really great, like what Narayanan had commented earlier. It was kind of a nice surprise hearing that this kind of like that government shedding some of the thick skin and allowing some things like maybe the operations to be taken hold of by the private sector. I think that's promising.
Yeah, I think so. In general, we see governments moving more and more from a model of ownership to a model of leasing or tenancy, where they can buy services and assets by the yard or by the meter, depending where you come from. And of course, that is backed up by private companies being able to do things they weren't able to do in the past to a great degree because there's so much investor interest. There's been this sea change. There's this excitement, this openness, fear of missing out that didn't exist at all 15 years ago. Picked up some interest 7 to 10 years ago when Robert and I were co-investing in space companies, and in the last 2 years really flourished. So that's one thing. Then the other thing that's really enabling this is there is a much stronger push from major non-space corporations looking to find ways now with space companies to solve their problems, whether it's manufacturing, solving those problems by using microgravity or needing a different vantage point or needing a different data set that can be provided by satellites. So there are a few things that have really come together in a confluence to build up this whole opportunity for space companies.
And I'm going to jump in here being I think the finance guy in the round. And we should also look at the numbers. So if you look at, for example, heavy lift rockets, we've gone from something like $10,000 per kilogram to low Earth orbit to now under $3,000 on the SpaceX Falcon 9. And then similar for small rockets, and that's just launch. And we had similarly dramatic cost decreases for operating in space and for spacecraft components, satellites components, and so forth. And of course, what it all means is that suddenly a lot of business models, which never made economic sense, are suddenly feasible. And entrepreneurs come along and exploit this business model. And as more business models make sense, there's more launch demand. As there's more launch demand, launch costs can drop even further, because if you amortize your Falcon 9 booster over 7 flights rather than 2 flights, it obviously makes a difference. And so we really finally entered this virtuous circle, I think.
Shane, are you piggybacking on that?
Yes, absolutely. And Raphael, you're absolutely right. Frequency is the key to access to space and flying regularly. And what we're really excited about and what we're seeing, a lot of our commercial customers are coming to us looking for launches to deploy their LEO-SAT constellations. And our customers range from, synthetic aperture radar companies to RF monitoring companies to Earth observation companies. And we allow a platform to deploy those customers' constellations where they want, when they want. And what we're seeing is we're able to partner with governments and international space stations or space agencies on the kind of more deep space missions. We're very excited to be launching the NASA Capstone mission this year, as well as our own privately funded mission to Venus in 2023, which is a great opportunity for us to explore the atmosphere there on Venus.
Narian, is that the change of the business model in the market, that you have been becoming our own entity, and is that the answer, or is there more?
No, primarily there had been there is a difference in the industrial scenario that was existing in India compared to other leading spacefaring nations. If you see, you all had a very strong defense industry emerging immediately after the wars, which was ready to take up the space activities as soon as the space activities started in the 50s or 60s, and they were there to support the activities all through. Whereas in India, we had a very poor industrial infrastructure at that time, and ISRO had pitched in and bridged that gap, and all the developments till date had happened within ISRO. Now, what has happened is in the last couple of decades, with the globalization and the large increase in activities of ISRO, at one side, the industries have developed their capabilities, and on the other side, a lot of enthusiasm has been generated in the space activities among the industries too, among others. This has prompted some of these new startups, as well as some of the industries who are working in this field, to come forward and take up activities, even though there had been no supporting mechanism to promote them. However, they had been showing very good signs of success, And probably this has also prompted the current reforms process where the government has decided to open up the space activities to and also to promote these so-called startups. So what the government proposes to do is these startups could be lacking in some of the high technology, high capital intensive facilities which are required for their development, qualification, and operations. Those facilities which are currently under the government sector are proposed to be made available to the startups and beginners, so, and also do some technical hand-holding for them so that they can overcome some of the teething problems and come out successful in their making their dreams succeed. So this is the basic reform process that's on.
And I think there are in Europe, in Israel, in America, in Australia, not only in India, a lot of startup companies, we're looking for international cooperation. So at least this is what I hear from our companies, because there's always a solution already on the market, and you don't have to buy a cow when you need a glass of milk, like we say here in the mountains. We don't meet virtually. We cannot go tonight to the camel market and have food there. We cannot go to the beach. We cannot celebrate, which is a pity. And I think everybody is eager to go back to a little bit more normal life. So we do not know when this pandemic really will close. I think Israel is doing an amazing job there and show how quick vaccination can work. But what is the impact of COVID-19 in your current business? Has it changed it? How you keep your contacts? Are you rescheduling stuff, or you're just saying a diamond is a piece of coal which must become something valuable under pressure? So if we have pressure, we go even quicker. Who wants to take that first?
So in our business, COVID slowed down. Well, first of all, I should say on the human spaceflight side of our business, of course, we also have the on-orbit research and manufacturing and advertising and media and other areas. But on the human spaceflight side, our two big client bases are first the space agencies sending astronauts up with us, and then on the private astronaut side, the ultra high net worths who fly with us and the corporate sponsored astronauts. So COVID slowed down the space agencies much more than it did the commercial side, the ultra high net worths especially. So we resequenced among our first 4 launches to the International Space Station to accommodate more private astronauts on the earlier flights. And as you know, we've already talked publicly a little bit about the participants in our first mission. Will be led by Michael Lopez Alegria, and the first astronaut on that mission whose identity we released was Eitan Stibe, very appropriate for today as an Israeli. Within the company, we established a COVID task force very early on. We more than doubled our headquarters footprint to allow our employees to work in COVID-safe conditions. And that was actually a good investment for us to make, because we more than tripled our employee base this year. So we needed more space anyways to grow into. And we've now since then taken even more space on. We hold virtual tours for prospective customers and investors. We literally had people walking around with laptops and their cameras, giving tours, meeting people, seeing our facilities, and did everything we could so people would not have to fly or to come on site and put themselves at risk. So we found all sorts of workarounds, and in fact did have a great amount of success through the year.
Yeah, and I think this is, I share that also. I think when we're looking to our startups, they were super quick. Our network was also really quicker. ESA, I think, is a little bit slower in these things. Nevertheless, it's great that you took advantage out of that. Shane, rocket stars, making flying rockets. Is there on the schedule a change?
A great question. After an initial pause in March, we kind of just evaluated the landscape, really looked at the impacts. We established the COVID task force, and really just took a pause to kind of see what the impacts would be. Rocket Lab, we're very fortunate, like most aerospace companies in the US, that we were able to continue operating as an essential business. So all of our production lines for our engines, our avionics kept manufacturing, which is very key for a launch production line. And as most of you may know, we have a large presence in New Zealand where we launch from for launch availability. The pandemic has been quite different in both New Zealand and in the US, as we continue to see. New Zealand has largely eliminated the virus, which is great. We're able to, all of our staff down there are able to function as normal. And for mission critical personnel that we need to get across the border, we work with the government to foster managed isolation quarantine. So really factoring in an extra 2 weeks of quarantine for all of our launch staff and our customers to come down to the range. Beyond that, we've been working with our customers, primarily our suppliers, rather, to make sure that there are any disruptions to our supply chain and making sure that we're getting parts just in time to produce our rockets and spacecraft components. So yeah, 9 months in, no complaints. We've had 7 missions last year, which is 1 more than the year before. So if anything, you know, we're accelerating going into 2021.
Right. We have seeing some nice deals. I know that a small competition to Rocket Lab, ESA Aerospace, closed 75 million. So we see money still flowing. Is that everywhere the case, or is the well becoming a little bit more dry?
No, absolutely.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. I thought Frank was asking me as the finance guy here. 2020 was a surprisingly good year, I think. I mean, everybody cuts the numbers slightly differently, but I think we ended up with around 5.3 billion of total venture investment in space. And I think 2019 was 5.9 billion. So that was a very good result. There was only really a couple of months or so which were slow, but very large rounds got done all around the world, in Japan, in Europe, in the US. You mentioned ESA Aerospace. That's a very significant deal for Europe, 75 million euros. Lakestar as the lead, very prominent VC firm. And of course, SpaceX raised something like almost $2.3, $2.4 billion throughout the year. So on the financing side, it's been full speed, and also on the deal flow side, we're pretty much full speed again. It's been very positive. The only thing that's been difficult, and Amir alluded to this, has been for us as a VC firm, the due diligence has been more challenging because we really like, obviously, to visit our investments usually, and this has really gone virtual for the time being.
Yeah, I think everybody is working and live with the emotional bank account and with the relations we have already. To make new relations is very hard. On the other side, I think it pushes also, as Amir is saying, to invest in digitalization where you don't need office space, you find a workaround. And I think if our startups, entrepreneurs are not doing it, who else is able to do that? Robert, you speak also about long-term goals, you're inspiring people. We try also today inspire people via remote congresses. It's a tough work, isn't it?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I was going to launch my book in March at South by Southwest. I had never been. I still want to go to that. It's an excuse to, I guess, go to a good party in Austin, Texas. And that was canceled. And on the day of, immediately when they announced it, I think I was the very first person on the internet to sort of announce that we were doing kind of a virtual event. It certainly wasn't a replacement to South by Southwest, but on the day we were supposed to have our panel, we kind of had a new space. It was broadly new space. We had other people outside the new space community come on Zoom, and this was back in March. To do an online event. It was a lot of fun. At this point, it was doing a Zoom event was still kind of a novelty. We didn't really have Zoom fatigue was not a thing yet, like it is now. In terms of on the business side, we were partially inspired to sort of take what we were doing with Arc Mission Foundation and commercialize it, in part due to what was going on with COVID, that people were thinking more about legacy and long-term memories and sharing stories. And we realized that this would be a good way to engage with the public and give them an opportunity to participate in something space-related, long-term, and a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. Narayan, what was changing in the crisis or in the challenging times? So the crisis can be also good for something, maybe, as my grandma is saying, how to make out of lemon lemonade. So what was the impact and what was the answer on that?
Yeah, definitely, as you would have seen, some of our ongoing programs were badly affected due to COVID for more than almost 6 months. But nevertheless, the activities on the reform side was progressing, and the reforms was announced by the government at the peak of the COVID season. And that transformation in the whole arena of space in India happened during this period. So it was a very, very fruitful and productive period that people could sit together and work on this particular change process. And that's where my company also had gained a lot of prominence. Of course, one point that I would like to mention here is my company is also a government-sponsored company, not a private company as such. It's under the administrative control of the Department of Space of the government. And we had been mandated to take over the entire operational systems from the Indian Space Research Organization. That happened during this period. Before that, our mandate was a very small mandate. So during this period, we could also gear up our company to equip ourselves for taking over this large challenge. And we are in the process of that. We are already approaching the Indian industries to manufacture the launch vehicles. Shortly, we will be going to them for manufacturing some of the satellites also. So that way we had been very active during this period, even though the actual launch and liftoffs had been affected for about 6 months. Of course, we resumed the operations in December, and since then we are doing well, and next month we will have the next launch. That's
exciting times. Thank you so much. Just looking to the time, we're halfway through, which is a pity because I have still tons of questions and we cannot even take questions from the audience this time. So next year we will have to change that and also connect you more with the startups and the people in the audience. So, which brings me to a point we spoke about already of infrastructure, space travel. We speak a little bit later. Some people compare us the space industry, the growth which we have now with the growth of the internet growth. Is that misleading? So I myself was working for Apple and had my IT startup before I moved to space, or is this just infrastructure and a little bit application? And now I think everybody's totally say, Frank, wrong. It's more.
I'll let Amir. I think Amir wanted to jump in.
Yes, Amir, please.
Oh, thanks, Robert. Unless you're feeling a pressing need to go for it. Okay. I think the comparison to the internet is accurate in many ways. One is that it's the durable infrastructures company that will succeed. So Intel, Cisco, Akamai, these are the internet companies that, regardless of all of the killer apps that were created on the internet, some that succeeded, some that became carcasses, the infrastructure, the big server farms, the transmission companies, they did very well. I think we'll see the same thing in space. So we'll see the substrate companies do very well, and some of the applications that sit on the substrate succeed, and some succeed less. Right now, the use of space and microgravity is entirely in its infancy. In the early days of the internet, for example, somebody might have thought, well, which is going to be the dating app that wins? Which is going to be the cloud storage company that wins? Which is going to be the edge computing company that wins? And today we see that in each of those niches, you have 5 or 6 multi-billion-dollar companies. And so who would have thought it could get to that scale and that there could be so many winners? And at such scale. And so in space, for example, people are trying to figure out now the same thing. Who are going to be the few winners? Who will be the one best small launch company? So we already see that there is room for several based on their individual and unique capabilities. And so space, like the internet, is going to be that platform for a number of winners. I think an example to look at in space is fiber optics, for example. So today somebody might look at the 5 key players in the in-space production of fiber optics and say, which horse should I win on? Should I bet on? Which horse is going to win? And the reality is, among those players who are all trying to do quite a bit of the vertical of producing fiber optics in space, is that one will probably do best in glass coatings. One will do best in pulling and rolling fiber. One will do best in materials treatment. One will do best in distribution to customers. So each one of those will develop its own market and create an ecosystem within that sub-niche as a user of space, not as a space company, but as a user of space. Now multiply that one by 10,000 times for the use cases in pharmaceuticals and material science and networking and then, and if you look at it that way, you see the claim for this becoming a $1 trillion market as having a very, very strong base.
I'll jump in, follow on with
please,
Amir. I'll follow on with Amir. So I agree with Amir about the analogy. Something where you mentioned about fiber optic, and I think back to a story that some of you might not know about. The 1990s, there was a company called Global Crossings. It was a Bermuda-based company, but effectively was operated out of Los Angeles, and they were building fiber optic connecting across the Atlantic, through the Caribbean. They were trying to connect the world. Now, this was the late 90s, and they had a spectacular bankruptcy. And the thought was, it was useful technology, but they were a little bit early. There was an oversupply. There wasn't enough companies to take advantage of all the throughput that they could provide. There were, video streaming companies, they didn't exist yet. So although we could imagine in the 90s, things like email, websites, Amazon, which did exist in the mid 90s, we might have had a little more difficult time looking at other applications from the internet. Tinder, dating apps, navigation tools, you name it. There's a myriad of things that we rely on every day. And the digitization of our lives has almost become ubiquitous. So I think, and I write about this in my book, about this analogy. So I think it is accurate. I wonder about where, once we have some valuations once we have some IPOs and exits to some of these companies, will the applications companies get valued more than the infrastructure companies, or vice versa? And then specifically into one area around space where we have a launch provider, Rocket Labs, with us today. There's still many other companies that are in various stages of trying to develop. And I hear this discussion that says, they all can't survive, which is probably true. But I think, more infrastructure, is probably a good thing. So I'm not one to sort of just try to dissuade any entrepreneur company, say, hey, don't try to get into this market if you don't think you can do something different.
A small wave we will see now in the decade of space. I know a case where even Andy von Bechtolsheim, one of the IT guys of Sun Microsystem, and I think one of the first investors who invested in a startup company in Earth observation, or is in the way to doing that. So now the internet investors are moving more and more to space. Raphael, is that the case, or this is the reason of this comparison?
Yeah, I'm as guilty as the next person of making that comparison. It's in our investor presentation, but I really like the other guys. I truly believe it. And the interesting thing is, and I think the other guys implied that, I think we're in the equivalent of the mid 90s for the internet, which means that most of the interesting stuff is still to come. It's like Robert said, I think with the internet in the mid 90s, people imagined like email and really crappy web browsing and really bad e-commerce, and nobody thought about Facebook and Uber and Tinder and all of these things. And me as an investor, I want to be around to catch the equivalent of Uber or Facebook when they come around, or at least catch one of them. That would be nice enough. I think another aspect which people think less about, but I see very often that's comparable to the internet in the mid 90s, is that if you look at the entrepreneurs we have right now in space, I'd say that probably 95% of those, the founders and the co-founders, they're engineers. They're aeroastro engineers and mechanical engineers. And if you're like old enough like me and you were around for the internet, then you know that was the same thing at the beginning of the internet. Those were guys out of computer science departments like Mark Andreessen. But a few years later, when we got the message out and people understood the potential of the internet, you got people like Jeff Bezos, who has nothing to do with computer science, involved and just like take advantage of that giant opportunity. Of course, always teaming up with people who understand the technical part. And my optimism is that hopefully we will see the same thing in space. And that's why I'm also doing all of these outreach, that we get more and more creative entrepreneurs into space who can team up with the CTOs they need and build really exciting companies, like happened in the internet.
I think you're right. The entrepreneurship teams, and I'm in a lot of selection boards, they're changing. And you see right away when you have a very complementary marketing, sales, engineering fitted team. So Shane and Rocket Lab, you're all engineers?
Mostly, yes. It's correct. We're all very technical, but we are expanding, we are growing, and I will echo my panelists' thoughts. I'm very optimistic about the growth in the space industry. As Raphael mentioned, we've got a record number of investments globally. The public's really getting behind the investment and they're really getting excited about it. And with a lot of these infrastructure companies, small launch spacecraft components companies are really building that low Earth orbit infrastructure. And if we look at history and Moore's law, we're going to continue to see technology build on top of technology. So if you use the iPhone analogy, all these spacecraft will provide the platform, and then the applications will continue to develop and make our lives easier here on Earth. So I agree. I think it's going to continue to grow. The first step is to continue to build out the infrastructure, but it's going to be very exciting to see all the applications and technologies that come out of that infrastructure in the years to come.
And when we're looking to India, what are the startups are moving? There are also engineer-related, or we have the first where we say, okay, we're looking to the platforms, to the marketing part where we combine technology. I think you should have an amazing pipeline.
Yes,
yeah, that's a great question. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
The startups in India, again, primarily was initiated by the technical people who are primarily engineers and other people, but they had the strong support from both the venture capitalists as well as the angel investors, and they had come forward to support these people, and that is how they are progressing well. Primarily, the startups are by the technical people, but they have no dearth for financing and other things. There are sufficient people coming forward to support them.
Okay, looking a little bit to the time, and I combine the last I would say episode where we speak about the business sectors, and of course having Amir there. Space travel is always an issue. Human space flight, is that just one of the business sectors which we see more? We have other business sectors. So which business sector will really take full advantage of the space capabilities in the next, I would say, decade?
So there's an interesting counter trend happening in space relative to what's happening on Earth. In Earth, everything is going and dematerializing, right? So we used to have all the different functions that our phone can do in many different devices, and now it's all in one device. And in space, the initial push economically has been for the use of data. And I think what we'll see over time happen in space is we'll start to see some hardware and in-space manufacturing to do all sorts of things that can't be done on Earth in 3D printing, bioprinting, and development of other products. And I won't even go into the long list of all the different things that we'll produce on orbit. So I think the maturation that we'll see will happen in two ways. One is we'll see a higher volume of people going to space and a higher volume of hardware going to space, to support the already growing data market, but especially to support a growth in manufacturing. And I think, when people have been asking this question about, is it going to be commercial? Is it going to be governmental? So far as deep space work goes, so work, lunar work, Mars work, government and commercial are going to be 100% intertwined for a long time. SpaceX and Boeing and Blue Origin, these are commercial companies that for many years will have governments as their largest human spaceflight customer. Commercial space travel for point-to-point travel on Earth will be a commercial endeavor entirely. So we're probably not going to see much government involvement in that. And also remember, in our lifetimes, orbital and suborbital commercial space from the tourism side will be a smaller market by far than the space agency human spaceflight. So we should take that as a point of perspective. We hear a lot about space tourism in the news because it's such an eye catcher, but it's such a small part of human spaceflight relative to government spaceflight. I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, thank you. Maybe go to Shane, because you bring that payload up. And what I hear also, I mean, maybe is this, I think the agencies also have to learn to let it go and find new areas where we have to de-risk so that the industry can take over.
Yeah, that's been the role of space agencies for many years, is to de-risk the final frontier, to teach us how to live in space, how to work in space. And just like we saw it happen with airplanes and satellites and rockets, now we're seeing commercialization being de-risked by the governments and being ceded to the commercial sector.
Shane.
Thank you, Frank. Yeah, I'll echo Amir's comments. I agree. I think Rocket Lab's primarily focused on infrastructure, but for the deep space missions, going to Venus, going to Mars, those are going to be, and to the moon, are very collaborative with governments and international space agencies, and we're working with them every step of the way. In low Earth orbit, more and more becoming commercial, and point-to-point travel. I'm very excited about the opportunity to have that. I would love to get to Europe in 45 minutes, so I think I'm very excited about that for personal reasons. But I think, yeah, it's going to take a combination of government and commercial in deep space and lunar. But for making life better on Earth and utilizing low Earth orbit, I think commercial space has the best commercial practices to be able to enable that, and has the right, business mind to enable that and make it sustainable.
I'll jump in. I think Frank's having some audio here. I think that the manufacturing areas is going to be an area to watch over the next decade. But although I'm not individually super bullish in the near term on the space tourism, because it's just such a long development timeline for the masses in space, I think longer term, there's probably ways, or midterm, there are ways to leverage space for entertainment and recreation that we're not quite doing. And I think this is where you get some of the novel applications coming from that will be useful. And, I think Axiom is kind of like, they're demonstrating some of that with their, bringing up high net worths. They're shooting a movie. So I think that's, or I think one of their two of their clients will be shooting a movie. So I think that's going to be leveraging space, and that's going to probably give a whole lot of people inspiration. Like, wow, you can do that with space. Maybe it seems obvious, but not to everyone.
That's true. Raphael, and then I give the word to Narian, and then I have the closing round already.
Yeah, I echo many of the thoughts my other panelists already expressed. I'm very bullish on life sciences in space, just because we have a lot of experimental results from decades of research already. So we know that it would make sense to do certain things in space. They were just never economically feasible. But that's again, that is now changing. I do like the idea of space tourism. I like the idea of point-to-point flights, as Shane said, also for personal reasons. Slight respectful disagreement with Amir. I think actually that he said this is going to be mostly commercial. I think actually there's an interesting military angle to point-to-point flights on Earth, and that the military might actually drive a lot of the initial demand and maybe even development. At least that's a possibility. But yeah, generally very optimistic on space manufacturing.
All right, short answer already from Narian, and then I have one question for each of you.
Okay, I also tend to agree that the military demands could drive the space activities a little bit. On the other side, what I find is the applications development, as was told, in the internet revolution, it was people like Mr. Jeff Bezos who made the fortune out of it. So people who will be in for new application developments and utilization of that will drive the market. That's what I feel, apart from the defense and related activities.
Thank you so much. I cannot agree more, because part of our department is also business application, and we support, I think, about 130 business cases related to application every year. I give to everybody a small sentence. You close it, very short, and we start again with Amir. Space travel, and you have to close the sentence. Space travel, travel to space will be in 10 years like
airline travel was in the 1950s in terms of its broader accessibility. And I just want to say thank you to Raphael. I spend so much of my time explaining to investors about how big this market can be. Whenever I hear an investor telling me, no, you're forgetting one sector, your business is going to be even bigger, I really appreciate that.
Raphael,
I'm interested in Axiom. I like you guys.
Narian, this is something question too. The space economy in 20 years in India will have. The
We'll
space
have about 100 times of the business what it's doing today.
Oh, yes, I like that. Rafael, we go to the VCs. The biggest case for space years in 10 years will be?
The biggest use case?
Yeah.
I do believe, I echo what I said, I believe it's in-space manufacturing.
The space business, and this goes to Robert, in 10 years, move to the new market of?
Mass industrialization, global industrialization. That's where you're going to get me.
Okay, good. I know that's a nasty game, but I like that. Next to Rocket Lab, there will be only the following rocket companies left. Give me 3.
We're going to go with Rocket Lab, SpaceX, and of course, New Space India Limited.
Okay. Colleagues, it was really a pleasure. I'm sure there will be an event pretty soon, in a half a year times, and I'll own you all a drink on my private accounts, because for that great session we had today, where I can help speak to you. You have already good contacts, but where I can help with our organization, let us know. We try to be investing into space, and we should not forget that. To the audience, thank you for listening, that we all need more space, and it's the decade of space, and I think you're all at the right time, at the right place, and you will rock the future. Thank you very much for joining, and a successful year, and see you next year, hopefully with our colleagues from the Israeli Space Agency, and I give back to Sarah.
Thank you, Mr. Salzgeber. Now I wonder what the next market that the space industry will expand to. Now we're heading out for a quick break now, but when we return, we will be splitting into 2 halls. In order to join the panels in each hall, please click on the button of the selected hall below. Now for more information on the panels in the halls, go to the agenda, read about the panels, and enter the hall directly from the program.